Hey, what's up everybody? So today we're going to be talking about procedural generation and the mods that are currently available within creations to improve procedural generation. So this is going to be a topic that I will be revisiting every 6 to probably 12 months, and this video is going to be like the first in the series, so I'm going to kind of explain a little bit about procedural generation, trying to clarify a little bit what procedural generation actually is and how Starfield actually does deploy this in the game. And then after that we will go into the actual mods, and then I will discuss like where I see the future of modding in procedural generation with Starfield going. So if we were going to define procedural generation, I think it would be probably best to break down this term. We can break it down into its two words. We have procedural, that's basically, if we're going to define that, that is a set of rules, and generation is to create. So when we're procedurally generating something, we are giving a set of rules to generate something, to create something. So how does this work? Basically, we use a lot of different maths to create the worlds around you. This has been commonplace in video games for, I think, at least since 1995. 1995, I believe they started procedurally generating leaves on trees in video games. But it is extremely commonplace within the space genre of video games, especially the large open universe space games like No Man's Sky, Elite Dangerous, Star Citizen, and we also see it in Starfield itself, though Starfield does do it a little bit differently than those ones do, and we're going to go ahead and discuss those kind of how Starfield does it opposed to the others. But what's going on here is when we do procedurally generate, we're using maths to basically determine like the topography of a landscape, where trees are going to be placed, where rocks are going to be placed. Even the night sky is, in a sense, procedurally generated. There is math governing all these astral bodies and how they behave within the skybox itself. And the one thing I would love to really highlight here is procedural generation is not making these objects, it's making the world. So these objects, like the gas giant you're currently looking at, an artist made that. But the procedural generation is telling us where it should be in the sky. And I hope this makes sense to you. The procedural generation allows us to basically place these handcrafted items like rocks and trees, which artists did design, and it basically tells where they should go in the world so it looks natural. And why do we use procedural generation in these very large scoped games opposed to handcrafting all the elements? One, it's a huge time saver. As you could imagine, if you were going to handcraft 1,000 planets and 100 systems, that's the amount of staff that Bethesda would need to do that would just be astronomical. And two, it makes it possible to fit on a console or a PC. If all these rocks, trees, textures, if they're all unique and individual and handcrafted, the storage would be astronomical for the game. So a game of this type of scope, or the scope of No Man's Sky or Elite Dangerous or Star Citizen, the only way it is possible is by recycling handcrafted items to place within the world to cut down on storage space. Otherwise, this game would probably be a terabyte in size. But, with using procedural generation, and instead of having, thousands of different trees, or probably millions in a game like this, there could be, 50 or 60 different trees, and they're just placed throughout the world, and they're done in a very logical sense. But we're going to take a moment and just listen to Todd Howard talk about procedural generation here.
And so we did find a way. We came up with a way, had prototyped of building tiles, like large tiles of landscape, the way we would usually build them. We kind of generate them offline, hand do some things, and end up with these very realistic looking tiles of landscape, and then built a system that wraps those around a planet and blends them all together. And we had pretty successful results with that. And so we thought, yeah, we could do this. And so there was a big design kind of problem to solve in terms of, well, what's fun about landing on a planet where there's potentially nothing? Because there's a lot of planets and moons, if you kind of, right, in reality, that, well, there's nothing on them except resources. And so we spent a lot of time figuring out, okay, let's just lean in on that can be a lonely experience, as long as we tell the player, here's what's there, here are the resources that are there, go find them. But I equate it to that moment of, we said about listening to the wind go and watching the sunset. And I do think there's a certain beauty to landing on a strange planet, being somewhat the only person there, building an outpost. And we are modeling all of the systems, because that's how we like to do things. So you can watch whatever that gas giant or moon, it will rotate and go, and sunrise, sunset, and all of those things that you would expect. And it's all really happening. And most people probably won't notice or appreciate all of that, but I think it gives them the ability to say, I want to go do that and see that on that place, as long as we tell them, hey, the quest leads over here, here's where the handcrafted content is that you would expect, and then here's more of the open procedural planet experience.
So that was from the Lex Friedman podcast, and I'm going to link that in the description as well. That is a very good interview. I'd highly suggest you listen to the entirety of it. So what I would say is, within the base game of Starfield, without mods, that is the experience you're going to get while exploring out in the procedural generation. And I will say, it is not for everyone. If you do not find this kind of exploration interesting, then it's probably not going to be for you. But I will be discussing some mods which actually do improve this, which add more points of interest, etc. to the game. But let's go ahead and move into how procedural generation is deployed within Starfield. So I found this little chart on a Reddit post that was explaining how the procedural generation does function within Starfield. I will go ahead and link it in the description below. I mostly agree with this chart. There's one little thing I want to add to it, but this basically explains how the procedural generation is deployed within Starfield itself. So we can think of it as two different methods. The first method is the procedural generation that Bethesda does before the game is published and it's set. Those experiences are going to be the same. That is things like biome placement, and not on this chart, but I would add it, is also the topography. This is something I have noticed. So you're going to find biomes in the same places I find biomes. And the topography, you're going to find the topography is the same as how I see it. So you'll find oceans where I find oceans. You'll find mountains where I find mountains. But let's move into the next area of how they deploy procedural generation. The next area is seed generation. So this is very similar to how Minecraft generates its worlds. By seed generation, there is a seed value which is fed within the algorithms that create the world to give it a variance between different players. So you can actually change your seed value within the console commands if you do choose to. I don't know why you would, but this makes it so each player is getting a different experience. We're going to find points of interest at different locations. We might find the same mountain, but yours might have tons of rocks on it, whereas mine might have tons of trees on it. The landscape will look different. But that being said, there's not going to be a ton of difference. We'll just see the same trees placed, they're just going to be placed in different spots. Same with like rocks, etc. So there is a little bit of nuance we'll see between the landscape, but in a general sense, the topography, we will see mountains in the same locations. We're going to see valleys in the same locations. We'll see oceans in the same locations. We might see nuances between trees and bushes, etc., like that. So this is basically the experience that each player is going to get. Is we're going to get a variation within the minor landscape features. Our major landscape features like oceans and mountains will be the same. Also, our points of interest we experience will be different. This is going to be controlled by that seed value we get, which is going to give the variability within these worlds. This is one of the things I do like about this game, and actually exploring in the procedural generation. I might find some really cool location out there, and you might ask me, where can I find that point of interest? And I can't exactly tell you. I gotta tell you, you gotta explore. Which is one of the things I do like about this game, opposed to other Bethesda titles. Like if you see something online, someone can tell you the exact location to where to find that in Fallout 4, whereas, you know, if someone goes, hey, I found this cool mining platform out on this ice ball somewhere, oh, where can I find it? They tell me the exact location. I go there and it's not there. So that gives us completely unique and different experiences, and the player is actually forced to explore and can't be given the exact location of, you know, certain locations, because they change and vary. So let's get into a little bit of the mods. So how am I going to break this up? I am going to first look at mods that affect the landscape. Then we are going to look at mods that affect the points of interest. And we're going to hit this a couple different ways, because there's a couple different approaches going on for both the landscape and the points of interest, and I kind of do want to discuss them. I don't think there's any wrong approaches here, and in fact I think in tandem they actually work very well to flesh out these worlds a little bit more than Bethesda did at the launch of this game. Where people complain about the procedural generation is, I think it's a little unfounded. There's nothing wrong with the procedural generation. It's with the handcrafted items or handcrafted points of interest that it is pulling to place. There's not a sufficient amount of them. There's 82 hostile locations. We could debate, you know, probably 10 of those are very easily debatable whether it's hostile or not. But, you know, for sake of argument, let's just go ahead and go with 82 hostile locations spread across 1,000 different worlds. You can see where there's a problem. We're going to see repeated locations over and over and over again. There's also other issues. Some people have had this. I don't really see it as much of an issue, but some people don't like the density of these locations. They wish they were a little bit closer together. There are mods that do cover that. They're on creations. They work perfectly fine. I'm not going to cover them in this video, but yes, the density can be increased so that there are more points of interest closer together on a tile. And in fact, there are several mods that do the opposite of that and actually make it so that there are less. And it's more realistic and it's more close to imagining us in our very early days of space travel, where maybe you might see like 1 or 2 locations on an entire planet. We're not going to go into those too much because I think they've been out for a while. They're accessible, they work, and they function fine. But what we are going to go into is some of the stuff that does improve the procedural generation. So one mod that I'm going to mention, I'm not going to cover, I'm going to put a card up because I did a full video on it a while back, is Bedlam Dungeon Randomizer. So I'll give you a general synopsis. This randomizes the position of NPCs within the hostile locations. It only functions on humanoid NPCs. It also adds raids, so if you're at a pirate base, you might see spacers raid them. What else does it do? It adds reinforcements, so if you're taking a while to clear out a hostile location, they will call for reinforcements, and reinforcements will be spawned in behind you. Quite fun. Check the card out. You can go ahead, watch that video. I play with it all the time. Ever since I reviewed it, I kept it installed. It keeps the repeated locations fresh. So the combat's, even though I might be visiting the same place, the combat's going to be different every single time because it randomizes it. It randomizes the combat, and it does it very effectively. But let's go ahead and get into this. So the first thing we're going to be talking about is landscapes. And the very first one I want to talk about is going to be just random vegetation, rocks, and exotic sizes GRINDTerra mod. So I will say, if you are interested in this mod coming up, you are going to need to download a framework before you download that mod. I'm going to list all the mods that are necessary in the description, so please check that out. But this mod, what does it do? It adds some random rocks and stuff. As we can see here, this is Talseti 8B. I don't know if you've ever been here, but looking at this right here, we can see that the trees are ginormous, and because they're ginormous, it causes these jungles to actually look a lot denser. The canopies like black out the sky entirely. It can make it as a very dark and gloomy kind of experience. It feels like you're actually exploring through a jungle through this. But we're going to go ahead and move on and check out some other scenery that was generated just by increasing, tree and vegetation size and adding some random rocks. So next we're going to go to Archimedes 5A. This is specifically the hills biome, and if you've ever been here, it's a very beautiful location, and I think it is in fact enhanced because these cherry blossom trees are probably 150% times the normal size. I wouldn't say they're quite double, but they are a lot bigger than they normally are. And it actually causes this to be like these dense forests of these like cherry blossom bushes or trees. And it makes kind of like navigating this world a little bit more tricky and difficult, because it can be difficult to see up ahead what's going on. And this actually does add a wonderful experience to it. And it does enhance the aesthetic beauty. I kind of wish I would have gotten a little video footage from high up on a hill so you could see it, but I neglected to. But, it kind of illustrates the point that these bushes are a lot bigger, and it causes the density of these forests to be a lot substantially more dense. So this next mod that we're going to be looking at is Planets Biomes Overhaul version 2.0. So specifically here, I went to what this author is doing, I should say, is he is making some new biomes and adding them to planets. So this biome in particular was labeled Carnivorous Forest and then in brackets realistic, and then we can see it's a bunch of dead carnivorous forest trees. Very cool. You don't see this in the base game, these kind of like desolate dying worlds, but I like that it's added to the game. It adds a lot more flavor. Like, I would expect to see some planets that maybe are dying, are not doing well, and I think this adds to it. But we're going to take a look at a couple more biomes here. This next biome was labeled Subalpine Lakes. I think this is a very cool biome. I think maybe the author went a touch too heavy on the filtering with this one, but still very enjoyable. You have a lot of like carnivorous trees here and lakes, and you know, it's a pretty cool experience. Like, kind of partially snowy field. It gives a lot of more depth to the game and the planets and diversity in biomes. So I think this is an extremely important project that this person's working on, because I know a lot of people do not complain about the landscapes in Starfield, but if you're like me and have explored a lot, you will find biomes that look exactly like other biomes on planets, that they're completely indistinguishable. And I think, you know, we have a lot of opportunity to make more nuance within the different biomes and kind of paint more alienistic worlds. But let's go ahead and take another look at a different biome that this author's created. This biome was labeled Dense Carnivorous Forest, and I found this biome, I located it on Jemison, but it was probably one of my favorites of the biomes. It features a lot of carnivorous trees, and they are placed extremely densely. Like, it feels, one of the things I think could have been done better by Bethesda with their procedural generation was creating more diversity in like the density of forests. Like, they're all pretty consistently the same density, whereas this, we're getting this really dense forest, and earlier we saw that other carnivorous forest where all the trees were dead, so we're getting a lot of we're able to see the full spectrum of like how a forest would look. They can look a lot of different ways, and this is definitely a location that I absolutely enjoyed exploring, and it just makes it a lot more interesting while you're going ahead and kind of exploring through these different areas, being in this extremely dense carnivorous forest that's just overpopulated by trees, and you can't see more than like 10-15 feet in front of you. It makes the game a lot better. But we're going to go ahead and look at one more biome that I did find out and about and talk about that one. So this was another forest that I found out and about. It was Indom 2. I didn't catch the name of this biome, but rather interesting biome to say the least. It's also a pretty dense forest, maybe a little bit too heavy on the filtering for my taste in particular, but I'm sure a lot of people would probably thoroughly enjoy this biome here. We're going to be taking a quick look into how it's very similar to the last one, but the filtering kind of makes it look a lot different. So I'm kind of on the fence on whether I think it's overly filtered or if it's just right. I'm not sure yet, but it definitely looks a lot different, and it's another extremely dense forest that gives us, it makes exploration very interesting to be kind of rolling through these very dense forests. I believe I kind of ditch the Rev 8 here after a little bit because it's just kind of too dense to drive the Rev 8 through, which, it kind of makes that foot travel important and fun, being able to go through here. So I think this is an extremely important project that is being done with kind of going through the procedural generation that Bethesda's done with the landscape and seeing how we can tweak it and adjust it to make new environments for players to explore in, so we don't see the same old, carnivorous forest over and over and over again. We actually have some nuance and difference in how these forests look within the game itself, to give players an ever-changing environment where you go to different planets and stuff and you can find different environments. This author is I've only scratched the surface of the different biomes that they've created within the game. I would highly suggest playing this mod. It does add a lot of different biomes. They can be kind of tricky to find because they're scattered across 1,000 different planets, and this is going to be a project that takes someone an extremely long time to do, and I'm more than appreciative of this. This is just a monumental task to put yourself on. Basically rehabbing all these different biomes and adding new ones into the mix to give us more nuance and variety in our exploration. But we're going to go ahead and move on to the next topic, which is going to get us to some procedurally generated filler content. I guess I should probably clarify by what I mean by filler content. Bethesda, they'll add little unmarked locations and like windmills and stuff, what I would refer to as like filler content. It might not be a named point of location, it might be tied to a point of location, but this is kind of filler content. It doesn't really have too much, but it fleshes out the worlds a little bit more. Seeing a gas tank next to a point of interest, or a bunch of windmills 500 yards out from the point of interest. So this next mod is part of the GRINDTerra package, which is several different mods. So if you don't like it, you don't have to play with it, but it is the Grindfield is what it is called. So what does this mod do? As we get to the next video section, we will see this replaces some of that like filler content that's around points of interest that you see out and about in the landscape. It replaces it with procedurally generated buildings and such. As we can see on screen here, we are looking at a procedurally generated building. Now that building you cannot enter into. It does have some procedurally generated buildings you can enter into. So I kind of have a mixed feeling on this, because this first building, it very much feels like someone stacked up a bunch of ship habs and called it a building. I wish I could go into it. I don't know how I feel about it, but this is kind of the good thing about the GRINDTerra mods is the author has separated them into their own different mod packages. So if something's not your flavor, you don't have to play with it. But as we can see up ahead here, we have another little shack, little building. This is also procedurally generated, and it does have a couple NPCs here. This I like a little bit more. You know, it adds this little tiny one hab and a couple of bad guys to kill, which is a little bit more of my flavor of procedurally generated content. But that's kind of what we're looking at with this one. So it's going to be kind of personal preference. If you do like adding like those buildings and structures just to give the worlds a little bit more flavor, this would be something for you. If not, you know, you don't have to download this one. So this next mod we're looking at is POI variations, no more duplicates. So what does this mod do? This mod makes it so that the points of interest that Bethesda added to the game actually have variations. So from a functional standpoint, what does this mod do? The first time, this is the UC listening post, I'm sure we've all seen it, but the first time you come across this post, it is going to be the exact one that Bethesda added. And then any time after that, you're going to get variations of this. So what do I mean by variations? I mean things like the furniture is going to be moved around, etc. So if you remember, when we were entering this point of interest, we only had one bad guy. So not only is the furniture going to be moved around, but the bad guys are going to be positioned differently. There's going to be different numbers of enemies as well. He also went ahead and removed any lore items, so you're not going to be reading repeated slates for this. And this does change up the gameplay. Kind of also does something very similar to what is it, Bedlam Dungeon Randomizer. They don't clash with each other, so I will confirm that if you wanted to run both, it's not going to hurt anything. But he changes up the enemy locations, etc. Let's go ahead and look at this point of interest over again and see it through different eyes. So as we're approaching this UC listening post again, let's pay attention to the differences that we're going to experience. So right off the bat, the guy was not up on the perch, and there was two enemies, and in fact, that perch, I'm going to kind of dwell on this a little bit because it's missing. It's not there. So that normally where that rock is, there's a seat, and someone's just chilling there, kind of sitting in the seat, waiting for any passerbys. And there's normally only one enemy on the outside of this point of interest. I don't think I've ever experienced where there was two, so this kind of tells me, hey, this is different. But let's go ahead and get into the actual point of interest itself, and we're going to see that some of the furniture's been moved around, boxes have been placed in new spots, and things look slightly different. So one thing I do like about this mod is something I've been saying for quite some time, is I expect as we get into space travel, we would probably use prefabricated buildings and drop them on planets. So it would not shock me if some of these locations looked or had the exact same layout, just with some furniture moved around and different things going on. So I think this was, this is an awesome project to be doing. What the author is intending to do is make, I did notice this little defect here. It looks like the author was moving around this wall, and I can see through it. But, this is a free mod, so we can look past little tiny defects like that. But yeah, it looks like a little bit of the layout was changed. And this mod author is trying to make 5 variations of every point of interest in the procedural generation. This would give us an absolute ton of different variants throughout the game, and these procedurally generated locations that Bethesda did offer to us. And I think it's perfectly fine seeing a repeat building, but having, bodies moved around, furniture moved around, the enemies are in different positions, maybe there's a different number of enemies. I'm able to suspend disbelief and go, hey, this is a prefabricated building that the UC dropped onto a planet, and yes, I can see the differences in how the furniture's set up and the number of enemies. It doesn't look exactly the same. I know one of the end goals of the author is to actually add procedurally generated clutter to the points of interest to actually give it even more nuance and difference from player to player, so we're not just stuck with 5 variations of each of like the 82 different hostile locations, but having way more variations than that, because you would be feeding procedurally generated clutter and having stuff like cups strewn about procedurally. You give the mathematical rules, the cup should be on the table. Where exactly? Well, it could be anywhere on the table, but it shouldn't be on the floor. That's basically how procedural generation works, and I think this is kind of a very good project to be working on, and what I would consider something that should be done first when we're modifying this procedural generation is just looking at what kind of low-hanging fruit did Bethesda leave mod authors to do, and I think this is one of those things. It's ripe for the picking, and definitely something that can actually add a lot of variety to the game itself with a minimal amount of work. Like, we're not creating the entire point of interest from scratch. We're taking what Bethesda gave us and working with it to make different variations, not trying to downplay the mod author's work, and just trying to highlight that he's focusing it in a way to maximize the returns on what he's contributing to the community. But let's go ahead and look at a couple other points of interest here and see what differences the authors put into it. So here we're at a weapon station. So these are kind of like a dime a dozen. You can find them all throughout the game, all over the place. This is your normal everyday weapon station. We have like the nice giant ship in the middle of it that, they're arming up with weapons, etc. And this is just your normal everyday weapon station. We can see some enemies flying about, moving around. Nothing too crazy going on here, but we're going to go ahead and take a look at another weapon station and see how that looks different from this one. So here we're at a second weapon station. This is on Archimedes 5A, probably one of my favorite moons to go to, and we can notice a glaring difference. There's no ship in the middle. So the author removed the ship in the middle, and this is something that, we could probably expect. Maybe this weapon station is a prefabricated weapon station. They drop them on several different planets. But what would we expect? We expect sometimes we show up and they are, loading up a ship with armaments and other materials, and sometimes maybe it's vacant, and in this case it happens to be vacant. Now, from a gameplay perspective, this does actually in fact change the gameplay a lot for this particular point of interest. Why do I say that? Is because that ship is a giant obstruction if you're shooting from one building to the other building. And then if that ship is removed, you can basically shoot from one building to the other building if you have like any kind of sniper rifle or long-range weapon very easily. So this does change like the gameplay for this particular point of interest. Not to mention the author does move around the enemies, adds or removes some enemies to give us some nuance and difference while we are playing through this. So like I said, this is a very important project. I would say that I believe the mod author told me that he has all the points of interest covered with at least one variation, possibly 5. I know he has plans to start adding procedurally generated clutter to them to give them even more nuance. But I would say this is definitely a must download, in my opinion. I did not really experience too much bugs with this. I did see that gap in the wall, but that's kind of small potatoes, especially for a free mod. There was one of the variations didn't have the data slates removed from it, so I found the original data slates. Small. I believe the mod author told me he was updating that to correct that issue. So it's probably already out, the update, but I would highly recommend this if you want to give yourself a little bit more nuance in the procedural generation and kind of vary up the locations that Bethesda already has in the game, which I think Bethesda did a wonderful job designing a lot of the locations within the procedural generation. I do hear occasional complaints that people don't like them, but for the most part, that sounds like, honestly, it sounds like it's coming from people that never played the game, because like a lot of these points of interest are actually really fun. They just get repetitive when you see them like 5, 6, 7 times, and the enemies are in the exact same spot, which this rectifies and solves that problem. You're not reading the same stories, things are changed up, even though you might have a very similar layout. It's going to be a little bit different. Furniture's moved around, enemies are moved around, etc. So highly recommend this one. But let's go ahead and move on to the next mod on this list. So this next mod is Dark Universe Takeover. This adds 50 different procedurally generated locations to find. What I would say about this mod is it's very well done. It's actually integrated into the procedurally generated quests. So if you pick up quests at like bounty boards or just out and about, like I picked up a quest out and about and it actually led me to one of these locations. So this author integrated them into the game very well. You can find them in orbit. You can also, if you land on a planet, you can just randomly stumble upon them as well. And as well, if you're picking up missions at like bounty boards, you'll have missions that will send you off to these locations. Now, these locations are, what I would say is they all have a very similar look to them, though the layout and design and combat you'll face are all going to be different. They look basically like an abandoned, what would I say, an abandoned military post from the Colony Wars. So it's very easy for me to kind of suspend disbelief on this and be like, oh, this is just an abandoned Colony War military base that has been taken over by Ecliptic or pirates or spacers. Very easy to do. Now, I will say that the mod author, even though these all have different layouts, different size, different scope, he does reuse assets a lot. I don't think this is particularly a bad thing, because this is how you are able to give us 50 different points of interest, nor would I suspect that we would, in the future, not reuse building designs when exploring space. I would expect us to have a lot of prefabricated buildings where you would see the exact same building layout, though it might have a different interior. So that is perfectly fine, perfectly acceptable to me, that he is reusing a lot of the same assets between points of interest. It does cause them to look very similar, even though they do have very different layouts and very different playthroughs. But, you know, it's very easy for me to just go, oh, these are old Colony War barracks or Colony War military bases that have been abandoned by both the Free Star and the UC and have just been taken over by pirates. So very easy to suspend disbelief on the similar look and appearance that these points of interest do have. But they are absolutely a ton of fun. You can get led to them through a lot of the procedurally generated quests. Find them in orbit very easily, and also you'll find them on landing spots. I would highly suggest this. This also is a free mod. All the mods in this list, in fact, are free. They don't cost anything. Some of them, like this one, I would probably pay like $5-10 for this. It gives you like 50 different locations to go out and explore. Some of them are going to be smaller, some of them are going to be bigger, and they'll have variations on like how many enemies are there and how difficult the combat is. Some of them, like the combat is actually rather challenging because there is a lot of enemies that will come after you. But let's go ahead and take a look at a couple other of these locations. So here's another location. I'm actually having a quest kind of lead me to this location. I picked it up on Talseti 8B. It was just a random encounter, kind of procedurally generated quest, and I was actually shocked that the random encounter quest actually did lead me to this point of interest that was added by a modder. So the modder was able to integrate that system into his points of interest. And as we can tell, this does have a very similar look to the last one, though this point of interest, I would say, is a little bit smaller than the last one, but it definitely has a very military base-esque look to it. A lot of the same assets are reused in this. Perfectly fine to do, because, you know, I can very easily see, hey, this is a prefabricated military base that was probably dropped on this planet during the Colony Wars. Very easy to suspend disbelief on seeing the very similar styles here. And not to mention, it kind of fits with the lore that there was this massive Colony Wars going on, military bases being dropped on little planets and moons all over the place, and they've been abandoned. It fits the lore well. So I think probably my one thought on this mod, or one thing that I would probably suggest to the author, is adding stories. You know, I would say there might be a little bit of hesitation when authors are kind of like making these procedurally generated points of interest, but hesitation around like interfering with the game's lore, etc. But I think it very easily could be done where we write some generic stories that, you know, tell the tale of how this point of interest got abandoned or maybe got overrun by enemies, etc. Maybe add a little bit of environmental storytelling to kind of tell that story, along with maybe some data slates as well, just to give it a little bit more soul that it should belong here. But that is kind of my take on it. Overall, extremely happy with this. This is, like I said, this is a mod I would probably pay money for. I would honestly pay money for it because it does add a lot of different points of interest to go ahead and explore, go ahead and play through. My only suggestion would be is if we could have some kind of like stories added into these locations. I think it would make it all the more better, because like I do enjoy these locations. I don't mind that we're reusing some assets to create more points of interest. I think that's a good thing, because that's how you're able to create a lot of things as a modder, is by reusing assets, or a game designer. It allows you to make more content. So I think that's perfectly fine. I would just like to maybe get a few stories, and it doesn't have to be crazy. And if you're not a good writer, ChatGPT's not that bad. It can. So that would be kind of like my suggestion. But let's take a look at one more of these to kind of just illustrate the point that they all do look very similar and have a very similar layout. I didn't mean by layout, but look. They all have a very similar look. They all actually have very different layouts. But looking at this one, very much does look like a military base. Again, they're all kind of looking like this. Now, I do like a lot of the features that are featured in here. Like you can find mechs and stuff. But like I said, they all do have this very similar look to them, which, kind of very much looks like a military base. Would love some stories to kind of like tell me, like, how did this military base become abandoned? What happened to it? I think that would kind of make it so much more ingrained into the world itself and feeling like it belongs there. But like I said before, awesome mod. This is completely free. You can download this. I've been playing with it for probably like 2-3 weeks now. Really enjoying it. Gives you a lot of different locations to go through. I haven't been to all 50 different locations. I think I've been to like 10. But it gives you something to do kind of out in the procedural generated world that is there. So a lot of stuff to kind of explore with this. And like I said, all these different bases that we do see, they all kind of have different layouts. You might see buildings repeated over and over again, but like you will see that there are probably like 10 or 15 different buildings that he uses over and over and over again in different combinations to kind of give these places very different layouts to them and very different gameplay as you're playing through them. So really enjoyed this mod. I would highly recommend it to anyone. But let's go ahead and get to the next mod. So this next mod is entitled Places of Intrigue, GRINDTerra. That's kind of a play on the acronym POI, or Point of Interest. Places of Intrigue. I'm sure you get it. But this adds some more locations that are a little bit more in-depth and handcrafted into the procedural generation. So the procedural generation has a larger pool of points of interest to pull from and flesh out the world. So here we're looking at, I believe this was like a consolidated mining mine or something or other. But going through this was a rather interesting place. Now, I did notice that there was an entrance to an elevator, but the elevator was cut off. I'm either missing a switch or something, or the author, I think, has the intent of adding an internal cell to this point of interest later on down the road, of adding some kind of like dungeon crawl to it, which would be cool. I would absolutely love that stuff. But having this point of interest, definitely a ton of fun. We're going to go ahead and take another look at another point of interest as well. As you can see, here is the elevator that I cannot go down, but we're going to go ahead and move on at this point. So here we have this point of interest. It's labeled civilized location, and I'm sure you probably recognize that tower. At least if you've ever built any outposts, you probably do. That's the watchtower in the outpost builder. Beautiful reuse of assets, and then he added a couple auxiliary structures to this as well to give it a little bit more flair to it. But this adds a lot more interesting things to the game. So we do have this point of interest to go through, which is, it's very simple, very fun, enjoyable. It's definitely reused assets out of the base game, but I think that's perfectly fine for people to be reusing assets to kind of create new points of interest. And I in fact would highly recommend that, because you're able to get a lot more work done by reusing assets opposed to creating them from scratch. Though creating them from scratch does have its benefits as well. You get to see a lot of creativity out of that. But I think right now, when it comes to where we're at and modding in the procedural generation, I think probably reusing assets is going to be give us a lot more bang for our buck. There's desperately a need to add more points of interest to the procedural generation, as opposed to giving us those really well and fine crafted points of interest. So I think there's more of a desire of seeing variety opposed to seeing how do I say it, very well in handcrafted things that take tons of time. So I think right now, where we're at within modding, perfectly acceptable to go ahead and reuse assets like this watchtower to make a point of interest, which is, in my opinion, absolutely great. After this, we do have one last mod to cover that adds some more locations to the procedural generation, and then we're going to be talking about future state. But let's go ahead and move on to the next mod. So next mod we're looking at is Batten's Shipwrecks. Now, what does this do? This adds 22 points of interest to the procedural generation. Very low spawn rate on these, I will say, but I did manage to find a couple of them. This first one we're looking at is a debris field, and that's it. It's just a debris field. So this is just adding a little bit of character to the planet itself. Not very much to interact with, but we're going to come up and take a look at the next location I found, which is going to be a little bit more detailed than this. So this next location is going to be a different shipwreck. This shipwreck is going to give us a little bit to interact with. So this is a little bit more than a debris field itself, and as we approach it, we're going to see that there is actually a lot of the structure of the ship still remaining, and it's not just a debris field scattered across the ground. So this mod it does add the 22 different procedurally generated locations. This is not integrated into the procedurally generated quests, so you're never going to get a quest that leads to it. And I believe, if I was reading correctly, there's less than a 1% chance upon landing to actually see one of these shipwrecks. So you're going to see them far and few between. This one actually has a couple spacers around, and I can also find some dead bodies, so there's a little bit of environmental storytelling as well. But I think I spent like a total of 8 hours testing these different procedurally generated mods, and this one I only found 2 locations, in those 8 hours. So as you can see, it'll take you quite some time to get through probably all 22 of the different procedurally generated locations in here. A little bit less common than what you would find in the Dark Universe Takeover. So as you can see here, we have a little bit more to interact with. There's a chest. I cannot go inside the ship because it looks like the door is under the ice at this point, so there's nothing to enter. But I did find a couple bodies of the passengers aboard this ship, which did give it a little bit of interesting environmental storytelling. But we're going to go ahead and let's review kind of what we covered here and how mods are working with the procedural generation. So we can look environmentally first. We have two different mods going on. There is Planets Biomes Overhaul version 2.0. This is adding new biomes to the procedural generation. They kind of function differently landscape-wise than a lot of the other biomes. Adding tree density, adding lakes, etc. to a lot of different stuff. And then there is also the mod by GRINDTerra, just random vegetation, rock, and exotic sizes, which balloons up the tree size, makes bushes bigger. This also can change kind of the feel of a lot of these different environments as you are exploring. So we have these two different approaches. One is creating whole new biomes, and the other is just adjusting some of the assets within those biomes. The one creating whole new biomes, I'm kind of curious about how that mod author is doing it, if he is adjusting the procedural generation to get like trees closer and more dense together. I highly suspect that's what he's doing. And that's rather interesting to me. And the other one is just dialing up like the sizes of trees, adding more random rocks and exotic sizes to stuff. Beyond that, we also do have that one GRINDTerra mod that is adding procedurally generated buildings. They're smaller structures. Some can be entered into, others cannot. Then we also have the POI variations, no more duplications mod. So what is this doing? This is working with the existing points of interest in the game to provide variations in the buildings, basically going with the understanding that, we are far more likely to drop a prefabricated building onto an alien world than build a custom building. What should the player expect to see? The player should probably expect to see it looks different on the interior. The furniture's moved around. We're not presented with the same exact story. Maybe the enemies are positioned differently, or there are different enemies, and the point of interest is different. And this functioned very well. I did see some changes. Some of the changes are bigger, some of them are more minor, but they actually do impact the gameplay within these points of interest. I would highly recommend that mod. And then as far as mods adding new points of interest locations, we have 3 of them. So I guess we can talk about Dark Universe Takeover. That adds 50 new points of interest to the game itself. They all look rather similar. They don't really have any storytelling going on with them, but they are integrated into the procedurally generated quests. So the procedurally generated quests do take you to them. Even though they do look similar, they do have very different layouts and also different gameplay as you're going through them. The combats are going to be very different as you do play through those different locations. Highly recommend that mod, because the sheer number of different points of interest that you can find in there. And then after that, we do have Places of Intrigue, GRINDTerra, that adds more points of interest to the procedural generation as well. I'm not sure about the total count of the number of places of interest in that particular mod, but for those locations, I did rather enjoy them. Some of them were a lot simpler, and then some of them looked a lot more handcrafted. So there is a lot of variation. We did see the one that looked to be using assets from the Outpost Builder, and then the other Place of Intrigue POI, what did appear to be a lot more handcrafted and looked like it had some room for future development with an interior cell. So very exciting work on that. I would highly recommend that. I believe the author is adding new places to that all the time. And then there is the last one, which is Batten's Shipwrecks, which does add 22 points of interest to find. Very low spawn rate on them. I think it was 0.5% on a ship landing site. So 1 in every 200 ship landings, you should find one of those locations. And they are going to vary anywhere from, a debris field, which is basically you can't interact with anything, just adding a little bit of flavor to the world itself, to, shipwrecks that might have enemy combatants surrounding it for you to fight with a little bit of environmental storytelling and, bring that kind of gameplay to it as well. So there is a lot of different mods out there that do improve the procedural generation. I think I will also mention this does not directly affect procedural generation, but the mod Bedlam Dungeon Randomizer does randomize the gameplay in the pre-existing points of interest, and adds a lot of fun with reinforcements and raids as well. So I would highly suggest that. I've been playing with it for months now. Definitely probably one of my favorite mods. That I also like the Dark Universe Takeover as well. So I will say, when I was testing these mods out, I had them all installed, and I am operating on the Xbox Series S. So I suspect most of you are probably you're either playing on the Series X or a PC that's probably a lot better than my Series S. So you should not have any problems if you wanted to download and install every single one of these mods and play with it. I will say, when I was playing with this, the environments were very rich. I was not seeing a lot of repeats. I was actually struggling to test the variation because I was struggling to find repeated points of interest to see the variations. So, I guess what I'm getting at is, right now, if you do download these mods that add points of interest, change the landscape, it does add a lot to the procedural generation in this game. Especially, it addresses a lot of the issues people had with the procedural generation, which was seeing repeat points of interest. I know a lot of people had issues with that. I think the variations directly addresses that. But beyond that, adding more points of interest to the pool that the procedural generation can pull from to insert into the landscape is going to make it far less common that you will see repeated points of interest. I mean, eventually you will, but in time that's going to diminish more and more as authors start developing more points of interest and we're able to add them to the procedural generation. I'm also very excited, future state, talking about procedural generation, procedurally generated clutter. So my understanding is the capability for this does exist within the creation kit, and we just need to get to the point where we're able to start implementing that on points of interest. That will make it so even though you might find a point of interest that is the same, the interiors will not be the same. They'll be cluttered procedurally, and it'll be based off that seed value that's generated upon character creation to kind of give it a variance between different players. So basically at that point in time, you like points of interest, you might get the same layout, but you'll have different, how I say, the enemies will be positioned differently. The clutter is going to be different. If we get to a point where we can procedurally insert stories into those locations, that would be kind of, how would I say it? That would be kind of like the holy grail of procedural generation, is if we could procedurally insert stories into these locations that made sense. So people would experience different stories almost every time. But this has been a long enough video for me. I rather enjoy you watching all the way to the end. And like always, please give me a like and subscribe. I appreciate it. It motivates me to do more videos like this. And enjoy your night. And I will be back in a few for some more videos.